People told children to watch out for monsters hiding under the bed, in dark forests, or behind creaky doors. But what if the trickiest monsters did not have sharp teeth? What if they wore nice clothes? What if they smiled? What if they shook your hand and said, I'm your friend? Imagine meeting someone who could become whatever you wanted them to be: funny, kind, smart, or caring, almost like a chameleon changing colors to fit wherever it went. Now imagine one day you suddenly stop and think, huh, wait a minute. Who are you really? Today's show is going to be about masks, hidden faces, and one of the biggest mysteries of all. How can someone look perfectly normal on the outside while hiding something very different on the inside? Hello there. Welcome to the show. Today I've got a lot to cover, but before I get started, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I found in the Epstein files. Seems like old Epstein was even confused himself about what a psychopath is. I haven't gone through the entire Epstein files, but I thought I'd read this before I get going on today's show. This was a correspondence by a guy named Epstein writing to Epstein. So let me just read what it says. The vivid term clinical psych excuse me. The vivid term clinical psychopath brings to mind the berserk buzzsaw wielding investment banker played by Christian Bale in the film American Psycho. Since some 3.9 million people work in the financial services industry, a clinically diagnosed horde of lunatics numbering almost 400,000 people would certainly be a matter of public concern, though it might only confirm some journalists' view of American capitalism. It is fair to ask, what is the provenance of this incredible study? The New York Times cites its source as a March 12, 2011 story in This Week, which attributes the psychopath data to an estimate made by a freelance writer, Cherie DeCornay, in CFA magazine, in an article entitled The Financial Psychopath Next Door. She wrote that studies conducted by Canadian forensic psychologist Robert Hare indicate that about 1% of the general population can be categorized as psychopathic, but the prevalence rate in the financial services industry is 10%. The problem here is that Hare never conducted a clinical study of the financial service industry and never did research that 10% of its members were psychopaths. John Grohl, the editor of World of Psychology, after the publication of DeCroix's article, asked Robert Hare about the putative study. Hare told him, well, I don't know who threw out the 10%, but it certainly did not come from me or my colleagues. The closest he came to such a claim was in a research paper he co authored that analyzed the responses submitted by 203 corporate professionals from 7 companies, none of which were on Wall Street. Nor were those 203 people randomly selected. He found that the answers of only 8 people at approximately 4% of the sample indicated psychopathic tendencies on a scale he had devised. Even though this was not a clinical study, the response of these 8 people, who might have not worked in financial services, were transformed via the blog sphere into a supposedly scientific finding noted in one of the most respected newspapers that 1/10 of those working on Wall Street are clinical psychopaths. As Ryan Holiday, author of Trust Me, I'm Lying: Confessions of a Media Manipulator, explained to me, headline grabbing trend manufacturing such a let me start over. Headline grabbing trend manufacturing such as this now dominates the pseudo news cycle on the web. Welcome to the internet, which is not known for its source checking. Unfortunately, it is then only a short leap to the so-called newspaper of record, which is happy to serve up to the public this non-existing study, which, like much else that demonizes financiers as a scientific finding. As a result, we now have madmen of Wall Street running amok in the public imagination. And this was from Edward J. Epstein, is the author of Myths of the Media. And they went on to say the New York Times published an article on May 14, 2012, concerning the question of whether the rich, from a moral standpoint, are good or bad. The story reported that a recent study found that 10% of people who work on Wall Street are clinical psychopaths, and that they exhibit an unparalleled capacity for line fabrication and manipulation. So it seemed like the communication and the confusion runs rampant, right? Even Jeffrey Epstein and his friends are finding it very confusing. So today I'm going to be playing an old interview that I did shortly after I wrote my book, back before I decided to take my work online instead of writing another book. During the first few years of this podcast, I focused step by step on helping people identify whether they had a psychopath in their life. Over the last several years, though, my focus shifted towards something larger: the impact psychopaths may have on society itself. Back when I did this interview that I'll play in a bit, I believed that brain studies provided most of the answers. I had not yet begun looking at another possibility: how trauma, conditioning, and methods used to break or fracture the mind might create behaviors that can appear psychopathic, rather than simply assuming someone was born that way. The deeper I looked recently, the more complicated the picture has become. I also later went down another road entirely, involving post war research, mind splitting theories, and programs connected to government experimentation. I'm not covering that subject today, but my views on those areas have evolved over time, and I'll save that discussion for another show when I get back about the DoD. At the time of this interview, I was looking at psychopathy through a very different lens than I do today. So consider this a snapshot in time, where I was then, what I believed then, and part of the journey that eventually led me somewhere else. So I came across this interview. It posted online a couple of years ago, and um, a lot of the information still matters today, but some of the things turned out to be quite wrong, and some of it I now see very differently. I believe when they talked about things about genetics and brain imaging, I believed that what many experts and researchers were promoting at the time, that perhaps psychopathy was largely in the genes, that maybe the answers were hidden in brain scans, and that science was getting close to identifying who those people were. People were fascinated by stories involving neuroscience and brain imaging. One of the biggest names was James Fallon, who drew attention after reporting that his own brain scans appeared to show patterns associated with psychopathic traits. Reduced activity in areas linked with empathy and emotional processing, genetic markers associated with aggression, and the headlines exploded after he made those statements. The message many people walked away with sounded simple: maybe psychopaths are born. But life rarely stays that simple. My own journey into this world did not begin because I woke up one day and decided to study psychopathy. I did not plan on writing a book, building forums, or reading research papers, or spending years interviewing people. My path started in Silicon Valley. I worked there from 1978 through about 1999. I started at Intel in their marketing group, in their corporate group, and later worked as a consultant. I was involved in technology, marketing, and any ideas revolving around that. At the time, Silicon Valley was becoming almost mystical, a place of innovation, intelligence, and progress. But eventually, I ran into serious problems. I developed a marketing concept involving Intel computer chips and found myself pulled into conflicts and legal battles. At first, I assumed I was dealing with ordinary business disputes, Then I started noticing something that deeply bothered me. Some people seemed completely different. They showed no guilt, no concern over what was going on, no conscience. They showed manipulation that felt effortless. Reality itself seemed to change depending on who was speaking. Facts became flexible. People seemed to switch masks depending on who they were talking to. At the time, I was not thinking, I'm dealing with psychopaths. I was simply trying to understand behavior that made no sense to me. I had known most of these people for many years. That was part of what made it so shocking. 5 years after the lawsuit settled, I had traveled down a road I never expected to take. I had become convinced that I was not dealing with ordinary personalities or ordinary conflicts. And remember, this was years ago. Back then, the world was in love with Silicon Valley. The tech industry was almost presented as a modern paradise of genius and innovation. Meanwhile, I sat there thinking, something's not right. That eventually led me down a rabbit hole that became my book, interviews, and some of the first victim forums online. Later, I became interested in turning my work into a podcast, and that idea eventually became the show I started over 9 years ago. I have that old forum of mine. It's back online now if you want to explore it. It contains nearly 10 years of victim stories from people around the world, different names, different countries, different backgrounds, different circumstances. But the stories started sounding strangely familiar. And in the early days, we did not have Google Translate. The number one referral came out of Korea. Isn't that interesting? For years, I didn't know who they were because I couldn't understand the language, right? I could just see Chinese characters. Finally, I figured it out. One of the biggest referral sites to my forum was coming out of Korea. The stories all started to sound familiar. People describing confusion, people describing manipulation. People were saying things like, I don't know what happened. I don't know who this person really was. I feel like I lost my mind. How could I have missed this? And I started realizing something. One of the biggest harms may not simply be the behavior itself. The greatest harm may be never understanding what happened to you. Because when people never understand what happened, they often blame themselves. Maybe I wasn't smart enough. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. Maybe I caused this. Years later, many people are still carrying confusion because they never found a framework that helped explain what they experienced. Today, social media talks endlessly about narcissism. Everything is narcissism. Everyone is a narcissist. Years ago, psychopathy was the focus. Before that, researchers like Hervé Cleckley attempted to describe people who appeared normal on the surface while hiding profound emotional deficits underneath. Later, researchers like Robert Hare developed systems for measuring psychopathic traits. Then came the debates, the arguments over the labels, the arguments over the definitions, arguments over who qualifies and who does not. After years of watching all of this, one thing stood out. The definitions can change, the labels change, research changes, but traits themselves often stay remarkably consistent. The manipulation, the superficial charm, the emotional coldness, the ability to become whatever the situation demands. As one person described, a psychopath said, the person you need me to be is the person I will become. Think about that for a moment, because that may be what makes these experiences so devastating. You were not necessarily dealing with a real person. You may have been dealing with a character, a performance, a carefully designed reflection of what you wanted to see. So today we're going to revisit this old interview and compare where I was then and what I think now. We'll look at brain studies and genetics, what science actually says versus what the television headlines claimed at the time. Manipulation tactics such as gaslighting, mirroring, impression management, and playing the victim. We'll look at where science helps and where science starts turning into speculation. And perhaps most importantly, we'll ask the question that matters the most. How do you protect yourself when the person harming you looks perfectly normal? Because maybe it wasn't the lover who broke your heart. Maybe it wasn't the friend who betrayed you. Maybe it wasn't the neighbor. Maybe it wasn't the boss. Maybe it wasn't the title, the status, or the position. Maybe the question was never who they appeared to be. Maybe the real question was this: who were they when nobody was watching? My book is really a collection of interviews with self identified or clinically diagnosed psychopaths, and it reveals chilling insights into how they think and operate. Their statements reveal calculated manipulation, emotional detachment, and an ability to blend into society with chameleon like precision. The people I spoke to in my book speak with striking indifference about death, human suffering, and social norms. A key quote from Bill: "The person you need me to be is the person I will become." Another person, Steve, said this: "I was 11 when I knew I was not like other people. I didn't see why the death was upsetting." Another one from Fred: "You probably don't feel bored at a funeral. I do." These statements illuminate core traits of psychopathy: superficial charm, lack of empathy, emotional shallowness, and antisocial behavior. Gaslighting, undermining the victim's perception of reality, playing the victim card, pretending to be the one harmed to gain sympathy. Mirroring, mimicking emotions and values to gain trust. Impression management, carefully crafting a persona for different situations. Understanding these behaviors is crucial for self protection and for identifying harmful dynamics in relationships. Many people describe a psychopath stare, shark eyes, dead eyes, or a sudden distant black look. People who have lived through abusive relationships often say they noticed a dramatic change in someone's expression during rage, manipulation, or emotional coldness. That experience is real in the sense that observers genuinely perceived something changed. What can happen is that emotional states change how the eyes actually appear. Reduced blinking can make someone seem fixed or predatory. Dilated pupils can make eyes appear darker. Facial muscles around the eyes can flatten or become expressionless. Anger, disassociation, stress, or intense concentration can create a faraway look. The second part of what you said about these abuse victims is important. Trauma survivors can also appear to have distant eyes. And you will also notice in the show that I did about NATO and the word psychopath, they figured out a way to make psychopaths actually to make trauma victims actually diagnosed as psychopaths. So if you had a lot of trauma, they might just diagnose you as having a psychopath because the trauma mimics a lot of things, and particularly in the eyes. You'll see a lot of trauma in eyes. So this is where we start to really split off here because the difference is that similar outward appearances can come from very different internal experiences. A manipulative person may appear emotionally detached because of reduced empathy or deliberate emotional control. A trauma survivor may appear detached because their nervous system is overwhelmed and protecting itself. To an observer, both can appear looking like dead eyes or black eyes, even though the mechanisms are very different. One challenge is that humans are extremely good at creating meaning after the fact. If someone later learns a partner is abusive, they may look back and think, I should have known from the eyes. Sometimes that intuition catches real warning signs. Sometimes the mind is connecting dots retrospectively. So the psychopath eye discussion is not entirely invented. People are noticing genuine shifts in expression and affect. Because many survivors report this, I saw something in the eyes before I could explain the behavior. So the scientific question becomes this: were they seeing psychopathy itself, or were they seeing changes in emotion, arousal, disassociation, anger, or threat signaling? Those are not necessarily the same things. And what I'd like to do now is I'm going to be exploring from a chapter in my book when I talk to the psychopaths I interviewed about the eyes. And what I will be doing is I will just say the person's name and then I'll be reading what they said after it so it doesn't get confusing because there's four people here talking. The soul fortunately has an interpreter, often unconscious, but still a faithful interpreter in the eye, and that's from Charlotte Bronte and Jane Eyre. Diane, has anyone commented about your eyes? And if so, what were some of the comments? From what I understand and what I have observed, when the mask is off, the eyes change. It is something that once you see it, you never forget. Kind of like looking into a scary black well and a feeling that evil is lurking. Some think that the eye color changes, but what really happens is the pupils become huge and black. You say it doesn't happen often. Do you have examples of the types of things or events that have made your eyes change? Steve, my eyes change color from green to gray, blue to gray. They go gray when I'm mad at someone. And I have people tell me that I'm freaky scary when I'm mad. And I stare at them like a robot that wants to kill them. Fred, I do not know about blackness of the eyes, certainly in myself, as I'm not often angry at a mirror. Maybe I should arrange some arguments in front of one to check. If people report seeing black, I can only speculate that this is because it's a color they associate with fear or emptiness. What you are seeing is not black, but emotion, or the gap where it should be. I don't know. Since I don't know if we see people the same way, I like to think I'm good at understanding these things, but nobody ever proved anything with a single datum. So I could be wrong. It could seem like when it happens, the eyes shine, that is, it will be noticed. I've got a good stare, maybe because I'm more of a French case. I don't get the black pits thing. Maybe it's not what I am at all. Or perhaps I am dead inside, but there's some sort of ghost of who I would have been, what I should have connected up with, where everything plugs in. I don't see that it matters, but it could be interesting to know. Diane, do people tell you they see the anger in your eyes or that the eyes don't connect with your smile? Fred, when I'm angry, my eyes are very fierce. I'm told, I mean, obviously, because I'm angry. But beyond that, they kind of light up, apparently. I can give a good rant and was often complimented for monologues when I was still involved in theater, usually on the grounds that the feelings poured off of you and you said it with your eyes. I've never had anyone comment that my smile doesn't match my eyes. I suppose it wouldn't be the sort of thing anyone is likely to say to my face, anyways, so maybe that doesn't tell us much. I'm very good at maintaining my mask, though. It can be forgotten about for days, left securely in place. Only something truly unexpected and sudden is likely so much as wobble it. And of course, sometimes I may choose to remove it for effect. In case you didn't notice, I have a great sense for the dramatic. But show just enough of that question is raised in the mind. Then spend a while reminding them how wonderful I am. I suppose, in effect, it encourages them to condition themselves. How could you think such a thing? There you are thinking that. Well, off goes Fred, giving puppies to orphans in his free time. You wanted a puppy, remember? Why are you so resentful that the orphans now have some then? Do you think you need one more than they do? Get off my back. Stop assuming the worst in everyone just because your dad left, died, and hated you. Clearly, it is an absurd thought, a nasty one, hurtful. Don't think it. You will, though. Next time the mask is dropped, for example. Is there something wrong with you? I don't know if it is anger or frustration that gets the mask to drop, for lack of a better term, but there is an association that the gloves come off and the pupils get huge and black. I think a less sophisticated, non socialized type has a harder time controlling it or getting it back in check after it happens. It must be hard to be on guard. Not actually. Aren't most of us on guard most of the time? Steve, people see emotions in people's eyes, but mine work like a mirror in the way people want to see or what they are feeling. This also helps to control people because they think I feel the same, and that makes them nicer and have less of a guard up. Bill, I am aware of the term mask and its intended meaning. This, however, is not exclusive to psychopaths. We all wear a mask of sorts depending on our environment. Where the psychopath is different is that we wear a mask not to hide our flaws, but to exploit yours. The person you need me to be in order to trust, confide in, support, and promote is the person I will become. Being free of unpredictable emotional reactions and guilt, I am free to be whatever, whenever, and that changes, and that, and then change that when necessary. As far as the mask situation, I agree that everyone has them, but yours are a different kind, and I'm not sure we're on the same page in describing yours, which is the interesting part of this conversation. Have you ever dropped your mask and then heard comments about your eyes appearing scary? How would you describe these many masks? I doubt you believe in God, but is one of them the image of a good church person? Or what in general are they, as best you can describe them? While the mask and act come instinctively, I certainly know when I am doing it. It takes energy to be convincing. So I imagine my mask most often slips if I am tired or angry. I usually am self aware of this and take steps to seclude myself in my office or take a business trip somewhere. The last thing I need is to lash out at a target before they have served their purpose. When this has happened before, I am usually quite good at making amends. It can also serve to prove my humanity. Everyone is moody time to time, right? I suppose another instance when my mask slips is in situations where empathy is expected. This is a particularly difficult emotion to emulate. There is an old proverb that says, the eyes are the window to the soul. What do you think about that? Fred, I've always liked the phrase eyes and the window to the soul. Sometimes the window to your soul looks back at you across a table on a date or in the staff kitchen when you're getting a coffee. Just a little signal that says, let me show you how well I know the real you. It's attractive. Maybe you put on a dress and do your hair. I put on a contact and smile. You cannot see my soul through my eyes as I lack one. Soul, not eye, you believe. Well, distance forbids, even if you wanted to check, which I can't imagine you would, but there is a window in my words. Diane, as far as the soul, I don't think you have one. Excuse me. I don't think you have one as we know of them, but haven't visited those thoughts in ages. So, to be fair, I will give it some more thought. I am always willing to have my thoughts on subjects evolve. At first glance, when you see those dark black eyes, it is like you are looking into the pits of evil. How this relates to a soul is a pretty big subject, and I will have to take some time to think about it. I didn't have a name for those eyes until my first forum when people were talking about the shift in the eyes. It was then that I had the aha moment and clearly saw what the eyes of less extreme versus this extreme person look like. Some people on my forum have said they can prove pure evil and they can see it in a psychopath's eyes, that they were staring into the eyes of madness. Here is how I see it. I have been in the presence of a few people who were clearly psychopathic. If something bugs them, there is what I would call dropping of the mask, and the eyes turn to pure hatred and black. It doesn't matter what color their eyes may have been normally. Many at my forum have also reported this happening. It is an interesting transition from the situation. I think it is like how cops will say once they smell a dead body, you never forget the smell. Fred, staring into the eyes of madness, at what point does introspection become waffle and self referential nonsense? As for windows into pure evil, I have some thoughts on this. I will repeat that I do not think that I am evil. My actions would not be considered to be, for the most part, all all that far from the norm. I do not set out to do bad. I think that what many people mean by evil is similar to what they mean by madness. Crazy people don't make much sense because they're not acting rationally, but they're also obviously crazy, not empty, so people let them off. It's madness without the madness, alien, hard to process. Watch. Maybe it doesn't make much difference since without the eyes and faces, it is only ever going to be reading through the script and following stage directions, anyways. Especially the words I have in mind, because they were completely subconscious and I have only just realized what they are doing. Diane, what do words have to do with eyes? Fred, I can feel my eyes change as I write some comments, just as they would if I said them. Words are tools, but eyes and smile are weapons. Having said that, of course, I can do melty eyes, or wise, or deep, or regretful, or lively, whatever I want, really. There, there, there even seems to be a degree of connection between color and current performance. My current partner seems to think my eyes are hazel. Others have said bright blue, greenish blue, violet, gray. They really are very beautiful, my very best asset after my mind. I have had female friends ask for pictures of them, quite sane ones even. I have even bordered on being stalked by people, both men and women, who have been fascinated by them. However, as mentioned, my eyes are very sympathetic. I mean that not only in that they can look full of sympathy, but like many other things, they are what people bring to them. For eyes, my pupils can become huge at times. I have had that mentioned a few times, but thought you meant more a change to the tone of the iris. That does happen too. Is the pupil thing normal? Surely, when you are the most alert, you want to take in the most information in order to make the best decisions. The world can be very clear and bright when you do that. I suppose it could just be what it feels like to have someone pay you complete attention. Diane, what other kinds of things do people say about your eyes? Fred, in terms of eyes, I've had various comments. Here are some of the examples. They're amazingly beautiful, so intense, social, and complimentary, but not but often romantically inspired. I feel like you can see through my act, often nervous but hopeful, like a relief that the act doesn't work so it can be dropped. Semi romantic, but often from people who have good reason to put on an act in the first place. I would not want to meet you in a dark alley. From guys, usually I ranted about something that has greatly annoyed me, such as someone behaving thoroughly unacceptable towards someone I care about, or some great social injustice I've currently got a bee in my bonnet over. You looked at me with nothing but hate after an argument with Super Bitch. Are you even looking at me during arguments or other negative but highly emotional charged moments? I feel helpless from a few girls when things have transitioned from friendship meeting to be physically romantic. When I've looked right at them and said something they insightfully or whatever feel. Those aren't word for word, but they give the sentiment clearly enough, cliche as they are. I'm not sure how many people really look at other people, pay them their full attention, and don't filter it through some sort of social pretense, but I suspect it isn't all that common. The more intense and direct, the more likely there is to be a comment and the more emotive it will be. I've also been told a lot of times I could get lost in your eyes, usually said with a distinctive tone that is halfway between complimentary, they're beautiful enough that I get lost in them, and slightly concerned. There is something about them I want to figure out but can't. I think that I have managed to do for the last couple of days has been to look at myself in the way that I subconsciously look at other people. I regret to say that I will appear to be quite a complex problem. It has been tiring. Ha! Is this how it feels? Have finally worked it out only to happen to myself. Now that is an idea worth further consideration. I shall think about it. However, I will end this with a thought. If empathy is seeing things through another person's eyes, maybe in my case, I need to try seeing things through my own. Reverse the flow, as it were. One end goes up and the other goes down, and vice versa. If I do it long enough, will I find a person in here somewhere? Will I piece this bits of them back together? If I look at how they all fit together hard enough, could I make one? Like a mask that once you put it on, you can never take it off. It would have to be a really good one, by which I mean, can I repair myself? And if I cannot, I remake what I have into something static but better. And that was their thoughts about the eyes. A lot of struggling goes on when they're aware of who they are. I'm convinced that a lot of these people do, in fact, understand who they are. So, anyway, I'll leave that there and let me explain a little bit about this Dr. Fallon and the brain scan business. Dr. Fallon, I talked about him extensively in the show I did about NATO and psychopathy and Robert Hare and all that. So I'm just going to touch on it very lightly here, okay? So neuroscience scientist James Fallon discovered he had brain scan patterns consistent with psychopathy, specifically reduced activity in the orbital frontal cortex and amygdala areas responsible for empathy, impulse control, and morality. He also carried a MAO gene variant linked to aggression. So, yeah, this Dr. Fallon claims that he did these tests and figured out that his brain was screwing and he was a psychopath. Well, personally, personally, I never did a show about this brain surgery imaging business and all that because I never really totally bought into it. But I'll lay out what's all out there for you to take a look for yourself. There's another doctor out there called Kent Keel, Kiehl. He claims that there's some brain waves going in the brain, and but none of these can really be proven is part of the problem. So I looked up, there have been a few legal cases involving brain imaging, okay? There was a case, Herbert Weinstein in 1992. He did have a brain cyst which affected his impulse control and helped to mitigate responsibility in a murder case. So a few times there's been somebody in trouble and they did find something in their brain which may have caused a problem. So the very first time this happened was this Herbert Weinstein person in 1992. There was another one in 2009, Antonio Bustamante. He had frontal lobe damage presented at sentencing for double homicide. Then we had John Hinckley. Remember him? He shot Reagan. And John Wayne Gacy, the guy who claimed that he had all those kids buried under his house. Well, the defense raised mental illness, not psychopathy. So, and then another case, Andrea Yates. She was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. Her conviction was overturned due to mental illness, not psychopathy. And let me see here. Anyways, I have the cases down below. So basically, the brain scans didn't help anybody find out if they were a psychopath or not, is how it really worked out. So it's all this stuff to do with the insanity defense. And I've already covered all this stuff. But basically, the insanity defense requires proof of inability to understand right wrong due to severe mental disease. Psychopathy, though a disorder, typically does not meet that threshold because most individuals retain moral knowledge. So, yes, basically, there's some ethical and scientific boundaries. Brain imaging may tempt courts and society to over rely on biological explanations. So, basically, they claim that a lot of things happen in the genes, right? If you start thinking about things, they claim that people getting cancer was genetic. They claim that this was genetic, that was genetic. So claiming that something is genetic seems to appear to be a pattern to me, at least, right? So by them claiming that psychopathy, well, nothing anybody can do about it, they were just born this way, was a pretty big lie to start with, right? Because we now know that they actively used MK7 and all that to learn how to split the mind, right? So they had to learn disassociation and all this stuff, which is too much for today. But anyways, so basically, I started looking into psychopaths when I was in Silicon Valley after being and during that lawsuit against Intel. I became convinced after that 5 years of the lawsuit that Silicon Valley was heavily influenced by psychopathic personalities, and I kept digging from them. So, and I met Robert Hare. For years, I believed he himself was a psychopath, and he openly carried forth the work of Cleckley. So, yeah, so it all gets very muddled around, right? As a matter of fact, they have this group that Robert Hare started called the Society for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy. And they had a meeting in Florida. It was their second meeting. I attended that meeting. It was in St. Petersburg, Florida, April 26th to 28th, 2007. Robert Hare was there about 19 years ago. I found I thought that, well, I wasn't that impressed with Robert Hare. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but yeah, I firmly believe that Robert Hare himself was a psychopath by the time I left that meeting. So all they were talking about was prison studies, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out why they were so concerned about inmates. Because my first thought always was this: we're surrounded by psychopaths. They've got to be sitting next to us, and we don't know who they are. Those are my exact thoughts from 30 some years ago. So anyhow, and for all of this, I guess I'm getting killed, right? I posted, I did my last on camera show interview January of 2020. I'd like to correct the record on that interview also. I mentioned that if somebody shoots me in the head, that it was not an accident. Well, it was a funny thing because at the time, I didn't know that they had already installed transformers around my house. I didn't know that my smart meter had already hooked up to a transformer, but they just had to come and do the final installation, and they did that around January. So, yeah, during all that time, I did not know that they were coming to murder me for my views, right? So if you want to look at how I looked at back then, I posted the show down below. And during that show, I said, I don't own a gun. Funny how times have changed. Yeah, I've got guns, I've got cameras that don't run on the first thing you need to do is defend yourself, right? And the only way to do that is with guns and with cameras that do not run on the internet. I can't impress that enough. Get cameras that do not run on the internet. So anyway, so it's been a long, long, windy journey. And over the years, people have had a lot of issues with even wanting to understand psychopathy or evil. There is just this blanket idea that evil is not really that prevalent. I'm here to tell you, we are surrounded by it. Turns out this is the final battle between good and evil at the very end. And people have not been very kind to the victims. In the years that I had my forum, people would say things to the victims like this: yeah, you're lucky it wasn't Ted Bundy or you'd be dead. And the crowd would break out laughing. So when people hear the words brain scans and psychopathy, they sometimes imagine some kind of futuristic machine where doctors can point at a screen and say, there it is. That is evil. But that really isn't how this works. Brain scans have actually been used in real court cases, and some of those cases became important because they changed how people thought about behavior and responsibilities. And that was a case that I talked about with Herbert Weinstein in New York in the early 1990s. Weinstein was charged with murdering his wife, and during the investigation, doctors discovered something unusual. Brain imaging, including CAT scans and MRI studies, showed a large cyst pressed against his frontal lobe. That area of the brain is associated with judgment, impulse control, and decision making. His defense argued that this abnormality may have affected his behavior and reduced his level of responsibility. That argument was successful enough that it resulted in a reduced charge. It became one of the first known murder cases in the United States where brain imaging entered the courtroom. Years later, another case appeared in California involving Antonio Bustamante. During sentencing, brain scans showed frontal lobe damage were introduced. The goal was not to argue that he was innocent. Instead, the defense argued that neurological damage may have reduced impulse control and decision making ability. The purpose was mitigation, essentially saying this person committed the crime, but there may be biological factors affecting behavior. The argument was aimed at avoiding a death sentence and obtaining life imprisonment instead. Researchers were also taking these ideas into prisons. Dr. Kent Kiehl, Kiehl, spent years conducting large scale studies involving more than 4,000 inmates using a mobile MRI laboratory. His work suggested that lower activity in areas of the brain involved in decision making and impulse control could correlate with a greatly likelihood of future rearrest. That caught attention because now people started asking whether brain patterns could someday help predict future behavior. So then along came James Fallon. Personally, I don't believe any of them. I think that this Keel guy is up to something, but hey, you got to make your own decisions. Stop relying on other people. That is just my view, right? The fact that he's in there in prisons and stuff and juvenile facilities, I find very, very concerning. Genetic testing also reportedly showed markers sometimes associated with aggression. And then something interesting happened. He did not become a serial killer. He did not become violent. He lived an ordinary life. So biology may influence risk, but biology does not automatically become destiny. So psychopathy itself is usually not considered a legal defense. Courts focus on different questions. Did the person understand right from wrong? Did they understand what they were doing? Did they have the ability to form criminal intent? Brain scans usually enter courtrooms for more limited purposes. They may be used to argue that someone had reduced impulse control because of brain damage. They may be introduced if someone suffered traumatic brain injury, had tumors or cysts, or experienced neurological conditions that could affect judgment and behavior. Sometimes they're used to determine competency, whether someone can understand the charges against them or participate in their own defense. So the argument usually is not, he is a psychopath, therefore he is innocent. The argument becomes, was there actual neurological impairment that affected behavior? And that is a very different discussion. So, yes, all along, this whole thing with psychopathy, for years, people were told to look for monsters in dark alleys, prison cells, and mugshots. But what if the performance was happening on a much larger stage? Maybe the masks were never the problem. Maybe the problem was that people were so distracted by the robes, the suits, the titles, and the fancy uniforms that they never stopped to ask who was wearing them. Be safe out there and goodbye for now.
Fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
You are back in the House of Mystery, and joining us today we have an author of Psychopaths in Our Lives and My Interviews, and it's written by Diane Emerson. And thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you, Al. It's nice to join you.
So, Psychopaths in Our Lives, do we have a lot of them?
Well, that's an interesting question because statistically in the prison population, they know it's 1 out of 4, which is, pretty high, but, kind of expected. And they will quote numbers anywhere from 1 to 3% in the general population, but that number has really never been statistically proven. So it was kind of extrapolated out of the prison population, which I'm not a statistician, so I'm not clear how they did that. So I would probably guess it's probably a lot higher, just because the really good ones kind of will go under your radar. So I'd probably have to guess, and you look at the way the world's going, that it's probably a lot higher than 1 to 3%. It's kind of a misleading number in my book, at least.
So do you think that it's growing, like the percentage of psychopaths, or do you think it's just we're more aware of it?
I think a couple things. I think we're more aware of it. Now, narcissism is growing because that's kind of an attainable personality disorder, but psychopaths are either born or they're not. But I think a lot of shows make people more aware of it, but almost in an off-balance way. For example, people imagine that all psychopaths are killers roaming in the alleys, and that they see these TV shows where it starts to give the appearance that they're lurking around corners to get you. And the really good ones really aren't out to kill you; they're out to murder your soul, so to speak. So
how do we distinguish what a psychopath is then?
Well, Dr. Gacono, who's the leading expert in analysis, wrote the foreword to my book, and he pretty much laid it out, but I'll give you the simple version. The simple version is that they don't have a conscience, okay? And all psychopaths have narcissistic personality, but not all narcissistic personalities are psychopaths. So the real clear divider is that conscience. And that's something you're born with and you develop between the ages of 3 to 5. So it's really a nature versus nurture aspect to it also. Like, for example, a psychopath who is going to end up in the prison system probably came from a lower means economically, social development, probably got the gene from one of the parents. And the ones who aren't going to end up in prison were nurtured. So they probably were raised by parents who spent a lot more time with them, worked on their development, and really taught them how to behave better, because that's a skill they have to learn. You know, they have to mimic what we're all about so that they can, so they can know how to work the system. They're not born with the same way that we are.
So you have to be born with it. You can't turn into a psychopath. Like me in my 50s, I can't tomorrow all of a sudden wake up and be a psychopath.
No, you could wake up and maybe behave badly, okay?
Right, yeah.
but no, they've done brain studies, so it is in the brain, and they do know that much. And so, no, it's not something that can be attained. A non-psychopath would have a cutoff point. Like, somebody might say, I'd like to kill that person, but then you're not going to actively be up all night plotting how to do it and spend weeks in the process trying to get it done. So it's definitely not a developed skill. You know, although people may, that's why I wrote the book, to figure out why do they, what is their real thought process? I mean, how do they come up with some of this stuff, and what's behind it all? So no, it's not an attainable skill level, thankfully.
And now psychopaths don't always kill, do they?
No. I would say that the largest. I've always been more interested in what would be called the socialized psychopaths. Okay, those are people who blend into society, probably run large corporations. It could be your next door neighbor. The percentage of them, the real smart ones, probably won't ever kill because they're better than that, and they know what the consequences would be. Now, I'm not sure that being pushed to shove that it wouldn't enter their radar. But typically, no, and that's where it gets all confused, because people think of the Ted Bundy syndrome. And, the odds of somebody lurking around outside of my house and following me down some alley and being some deranged psychopathic serial killer is really pretty slim. You're more likely to be killed by somebody or have somebody do you wrong if that psychopath is in your inner circle. Stranger danger really gets overplayed in the media.
Yeah. Oh, so how do we determine then? So you're saying that these psychopaths that you've been studying and looking into are the ones that learn to mimic. So when they're like at a funeral, they really don't care. They're bored. But when they're around us, they'll act like they care.
Yeah. Well, they have to learn, as they describe it in my interviews, they have to learn what color and what all the buttons are, okay? They're not, as a matter of fact, it was interesting because two of the psychopaths I interviewed, they first started to notice the difference in themselves and other people had to do around a death. And they quickly realized that their behavior and emotions were being watched because they weren't following and behaving like everybody else. So they started to stand out. So that became the first thing, actually the first self-awareness they had, that they were different than other people. And so then they learned how to model that. That's why a lot of times if you watch a true crime show, which I kind of watch probably too many of, but they're kind of easy to pick out in the crowd, because you'll see that if you watch a really good Dateline show or something, people will comment on their behavior, like, they'll be texting at a funeral, they'll be, hooking up with their mistress, a week after the funeral. They'll call the insurance company the day after the murder to figure out when they're going to get paid. So if people are really paying attention, you can spot them. You can spot them. So that was my goal. I've had a victim support forum for 18 years now. It was the first one online. And I really thought I'd heard it all from the victims, but never in the detail of how did it really happen. The victims over the years would talk about things like, I felt like I was going crazy, and he told me I was crazy. But really, the behind that was what I was the most interested in, was how does this, perfectly normal person get engaged with somebody, allow themselves to be isolated, So yeah, it's a really different picture. And like for example, in a murder trial, I mean, they will usually always take the stand because, after all, they're the smartest person in the room. That's their view of the world. So, and it's about control. So I'm sure that their defense attorney probably really tried to wrestle with them to not take the stand, but they believe so strongly that they're so much smarter than everybody else that they'll do these kinds of behavioral things.
Well, that's, and you're talking about that, it's sort of like the movie Gaslight.
My favorite movie. My favorite movie.
Yeah,
my very favorite movie on earth, yeah.
And how he was trying to make Ingrid Bergman, think she was nuts.
Yeah, well, that's where the actual term came from. In 1944, I think, was that movie, and really everybody should watch that movie. Charles Boyer is in it, and it is a fabulous movie. And that's where the term gaslight actually originated from.
So how does someone fall for that? Like, I've seen that movie, and I see how they did it, but things were quite a bit more naive back then.
Yeah.
I think they were, anyway. How does someone fall for that now? And I don't even know if that's the right term, because it's not like I'm trying to make them sound stupid for being with a psychopath, but how does that happen?
Well, how it happens is that they're very, very good at analyzing people. For example, they're very good listeners, and so they will be able to extract information out of you that they will be able to then later turn on you. And isolation and control become part of the issue. Like that, let's say you're going along and you're a happy, successful person and you meet some guy on Match.com or Christian Mingle, and he just seems like everything, everything you've always asked for. And what all three of them said, which is very true, is that they're mining you for information because they need to know where all your buttons are. And then the isolation process will start. They'll start kind of trying to get your friends out of the picture, get you a little bit more removed from your family. And it sounds so bizarre that in the end, the victim is actually the one who gets the worst rap, because people find it unbelievable that how did, Susie down the block, who just has always seemed so normal and raised well and stuff, how does she end up in the end with this person? Well, it's a process, and these people are very skilled at that process, and that's why I wanted to get behind the scenes of how does the process work. I mean, what do they say to you? And usually it's something that it takes time. And remember, they have time, and they put the time into the work. And so it becomes a matter of you're slowly being driven kind of crazy. And then pretty soon people in your world will think you start to sound kind of crazy because they think this guy seems like just the cat's meow to everybody else. So it's like, how could you possibly be thinking this way about it? So they're very good at turning your friends and family against you, the victim, because they have a way of putting that outside persona. So it's a very process that they go through. And most of the victims over the years at my forum have been, educated people who, you probably would never suspect would get involved with somebody like that. And the number one thing they look for is kindness and generosity. They look for people who will look past those red flags. And then they have underneath that a lot of ways to dismantle those red flags. Like, for example, if they drop the mask and, blow up over something, and you start to question them, they have a whole series of things that they'll use to convince you that really wasn't reality, which is really what gaslighting is about. It's about rearranging your reality to fit theirs.
So I'm just not. So now, so some of those serial killers that are out there, and they have wives or people that have been close to them, we always assume that the wife or the spouse, if it's a male, knows and knew about it. But that's not necessarily always true, is it?
Well, I think it's about how deep that person would really want to come within their own conscience. I mean, there's probably a lot of denial there that, hey, I was sleeping next to a guy who was a serial killer all these years. But I think if you really, most of your better true crime books, like Anne Rule and Jackals, which are now departed, but they wrote some very good books where they got into the family and the family background. and the people that, how they really view that person. And there's a lot of hiding, there's a lot of denial, there's a lot of, they've accepted the behavior for so long that they really start to not see any way out. So I think they may act surprised, but I'm not really convinced that they are surprised. They see things, but people try to brush things off. People try to paint a glorier picture. And a lot of times in relationships, people will go back to the beginning times and think of the happy times and kind of just push off the behaviors that have started to emerge. And just remember those first good days, or the first good years or whatever. So, yeah, it does happen, but I think when people can finally reflect, they could actually see the patterns were there. I mean, there's people that, like, for example, you see these stories and, the wife gets murdered or the husband or whatever, and the friends will say, well, she told me that if I got murdered, it was probably him. Well, I mean, really?
Then why are you still there? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not safe to still be in the same house with that person. So, when you start to question somebody and you really think you're dealing with somebody evil, the last place you should be announcing that divorce is in their presence and then continuing to be under the same roof. So if you've got to go to that level to start telling people, if these things happen, look at him or her, you're in so deep that really you need to get out. You need a safe exit plan. So I think it's a lot of denial. The families don't want to admit that they raised a psychopath. The parents will try to paint a glorier picture. So unless you really get behind the scenes with that family, or on the other hand, maybe they got the gene from that parent who's being interviewed and saying he was a swell kid. So, you really have to take a real hard look at, denial, and, they've accepted the behavior for a long time. They wish for the best, and it didn't work out that way.
So another big term, like we hear psychopath a lot, and the other one we hear is sociopath, especially lately. What's really the difference?
Well, Dr. Gacono and Cavisa wrote probably the best differentiation, and it's pretty technical. I can tell you what the general population thinks. The general population seems to feel that sociopath is probably not going to be a killer, and they see psychopath as more of a killer. So it's really, society has kind of adopted these terms. Like, for example, when you hear a news story, they'll say, they might even use all three terms, psychopath, sociopath, narcissistic, all in the same words. And it was interesting when I interviewed these guys, two of them felt that they rejected the term psychopath because that made them feel more monster-like. But one of them actually embraced the word psychopath. He felt like he was a lion and the rest of them were hyenas. So even in their own world, they tend to kind of differentiate. So people tend to think psychopath and sociopath are different, and really it all boils down to that conscience and evil. It's really evil is what it is.
So when you were going to write the book, how did you pick which people you would use, like when you interviewed them?
Well, I started to write the book about 4 times from a victim standpoint. And then I decided that there had to be another angle. And over the years, because of my forum, I get contacted by psychopaths. And normally, well, all the time, they were always banned from my forum, when they would try to register and come in and try to talk, because clearly, it made the victims very uncomfortable. So what I did was, one day I got contacted by one who was really a smart guy. Well, they were all very smart. And so then I'd had a few others that had contacted me, and 2 of them had been formally diagnosed, and one of them was self-diagnosed. And so I just had the idea. I thought, well, hey, wait a minute. Maybe I should write from this standpoint, because no one really ever has. I mean, no one has really ever asked them these questions and trying to get to the truth. And so then I also decided that I would only interview them via email. I didn't want to interview them via Skype, and I clearly didn't want to interview them if they were living in or close to me.
You weren't going to have them over for coffee?
No.
Oh.
No. And so I think all of them were probably in their close to 30 range, and actually the thing that really got to me was that I was actually kind of amazed at how willing to self-discover themselves they were, and then their level of self-awareness. So I basically found 3, and I decided that I would do the 3 because then I would also have a checks and balance system. And they were completely different locations. So I would be able to start to see the patterns better. And I thought, well, I'll just go with these 3 and see what I find from them. And then also, if I find something that's interesting and could help people, because really it could be a roadmap to your future. I mean, if you know the signs and the way that they behave, hopefully you can disengage quicker. And I've heard from a lot of people that said it helped me to reflect on my last relationship. And it took me out of that loon bin thinking that this wasn't all my fault. I mean, I really was just a player in a sick person's game. So, yeah, it was a matter of trying to, and people can become re-victimized because they're still nice and kind people. So a new one will show up. And I found that pattern over the years with victims. They meet a new one. And they thought it was different than the last one. So I felt like if I got them to really talk to me, that they would be able to express things that would be keys and kind of like a roadmap for people. And interestingly enough, they were very interested in talking. One of them talked so much that I ended up with, I think about 80,000 words with him. So yeah, he was really into the talking. And the other 2 were more scheduled. They would, I would ask them questions, and it was fascinating because, there were a lot of questions that kind of had rattled around in my mind for a very long time, like gaslighting. And that was very interesting because none of them knew what the term was, but they went off and clearly Googled it, and they they came back with an amazing response. It was like, yeah, that's like the number one thing in my toolkit. So yeah, they basically, I'm sure that they learned a lot through it, but I learned even more. So it was kind of making a deal that I had to be open with them because they were being open with me. And it really gave me an insight into their thought process because I'd ask a question and they would come back, the first part of the answer, and that's why, I thought translating it, me taking notes and interviewing on the phone and stuff, would lose part of, would have lost a whole lot of it. Because they would start off on one train of thought, okay, like, well, yeah, that was really a bad deal. And then they would continue talking and saying, well, yeah, but, the odds are I could have gotten caught if I would have done that. So the first part of their conversation and answer to my questions would be probably more like what you would see as a person in their life. But then as they started talking, the veil would come back. It would start to draw back the veil on, what all of this really meant to them. Like, for example, one of them, which I was kind of like, and the other thing is I didn't want them to have access to my emotions because that's what they feed off of. They absolutely read you. They can see by, how you react to things. And I didn't want them to then start changing things around because of my reaction. I wanted to be in a place where, I could have my gasping moments and my startled moments and not have them ever see that was how I was responding to things. For example, one of them actually gives drugs, antidepressants and mood stabilizers to his victims. And that, to me, was like, I like this. I'm sitting there in the morning, and I'm having my coffee, and I'm reading this, and I actually just let out a gasp. And then and I'm not a nervous laugher. I like to laugh. Okay, my family has a good sense of humor, but I let out such a weird laugh that my dogs actually ran in the room. Yeah. Because it was like, and I had to talk to a couple of friends of mine about it. I set up a scenario. I didn't tell them exactly why I was asking. And it was interesting because they all had that nervous laugh. And I don't usually have a nervous laugh. I mean, and I don't have a passive-aggressive attitude, but I don't have a nervous laugh. But I was like so startled. So when I asked one of the other ones, hey, would you give drugs to victims? And he started off with, I said, one of my people I'm interviewing does, and he started off with, oh, that's deplorable. Why would you do something like that? And, then it boils down to, well, they could end up in the hospital and get a blood test, and all the tracks would lead back to me. So, the deplorable part quickly dissolved into the why, because he was probably a little bit smarter than the other one, and he could see the chemical trail. It had nothing to do with, like me, if I said that's deplorable and found it upsetting, I would stick with that emotion. It wouldn't shift into, well, yeah, but maybe I might get caught. So they just had very different reactions. So I wanted to keep myself out of the middle of the reactions, and I wanted to keep them from trying to read me. And I just didn't let them bait me, because you can Google anybody. Like one day they were talking about the weather here. Well, okay, I got it. You Googled me. You know where I live, okay? But I just would never respond. If it was off the track, I just let them just keep talking. So they really at times got a little befuddled because they couldn't feed back off of my emotions because I wasn't letting them see my emotions. Like I didn't write the guy back and say, "Oh my God, you gave them drugs? That is so evil." I just said, "Oh, well, that's interesting. How long did it take?" Because I knew about how long it would take for them to take effect. So I just said, "Oh, that's interesting. How long did it take?" So I was kind of testing him. He says, "It comes right back, well, about 3 weeks." I went, "Well, yeah, okay." So I purposely kept myself out of the middle of the scenario.
It's like Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, it actually, the writing part was my best idea because they wove through the truth once they got past the first part of what would have been an acceptable response. Then they got into the real reason for that response. So it was interesting, and I at one point I got a little bit overwhelmed, because I was interviewing 3 of them at a time. And one of them was just constantly talking. I mean, to the point that, and while he was talking, I was there just to, read and answer back. So, I mean, I was up to all hours. If you want to keep talking, I'll keep recording it. They all had different responses to things, but all their responses were the same, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So do they have one, they all have the same traits or MO about how they do things?
Oh yeah, totally. And then the main MO is control. Have to have control. And that's when they lose it, is when they lose control. One of them actually, if a relationship ended up badly where he wasn't in control, he would actually circle back to that person, re-engage them, and then dump them and break their heart so that he was able to win. So it's really, it all is about control. Every bit of it.
And so have they the ability to love then, or have emotion, like real emotion, or is it all sort of put on?
Oh, it's all put on. It's 100% put on. They'll never love you. And that's the other thing that I was hoping readers would come to the conclusion if you've been involved with one, and maybe the next time you won't answer the phone. And they laid out things very simply. I mean, they actually came up with some comments that that made a startling amount of sense. Maybe one of them said something about, well, maybe she shouldn't have picked up the phone. It's like, well, yeah, probably true. So no, they all had the same patterns. They all had the same behaviors. So they all have the same desire to control, and it has to go in their way. And they'll figure it out a way.
So are they the bad kids in school? Like you say, it starts something 3 to 5 years old. So when
not
they're
necessarily.
No.
They could be the model student in school. It depends on how good they are. It depends on how educated and nurturing their parents are. They could be the classmate that everybody looks back as having been just a swell guy. So no, they could actually be the more popular people in school. They don't think of you like you think of them, but they actually that they're so clever in learning how to fit in and mold into society that no, they don't end up being somebody that people in general don't like. They generally end up being somebody who everybody likes.
And so the narcissist part. Now you were saying how one can be with, like, a narcissist doesn't always become a psychopath.
No, you can't become one. You're born one.
Right.
Yeah. But narcissism is on the rise. I was reading a study the other day. Narcissism is on the rise. All you have to really think of is selfie sticks. so, the Kardashian era narcissism, the vying to be on reality TV shows, that's where you can see the exploding level of narcissism. But it's an entirely different, they're not going to go on to become psychopaths.
So how do you determine the difference? Like when someone is narcissist and they've got that displayed ego, I guess you would say, or whatever they've got going on, how do you know that they're not a psycho? Like, I'm trying to figure out how you would pick out something.
Well, I think that you have to pay attention, and the number one thing that victims said over the years was that when the red flags started showing, they rushed in and painted them white. So when they'll start to press your limits of what you'll find is acceptable behavior. And so it's a matter of paying attention. And I think if you pay attention to your instincts, that'll start to lead you down the best path ever. Because you'll start to see these things, and instead of excusing them or hearing excuses to excuse them, the best thing to do is to start to really pay attention to how they're behaving in general. Are they really sincere, or is it an act? They move in quickly, and they know how to move in quickly. And you have really provided them with all the ammunition to move in the hardest. Those people will talk about, God, this person was the best listener on earth. Well, they all said, how do I figure out the code to your vault if I don't know the numbers? So, of course, they've got to be engaging. Otherwise, they've got to get you to talk, because otherwise they won't know how to manipulate you. So, I'm not a paranoid person, but I'm a very cautious person with people. And it would take a lot to get into my world, because once these behaviors start to develop, I wouldn't let kindness and but they also have a lot of tricks that they use when those moments happen. For example, let's say you get in this big fight and they unmask, okay? I don't know if you've ever seen anybody unmask, but it's a horrifying experience when the eyes get black. It's like looking into the eyes of the devil. They have a list of things that they will tell you. The number one thing is, well, I was abused as a child. That's a really good one, okay? Because, what kind of kind, caring person is going to not give the guy some slack? The next day they meekly apologize and say, I really didn't mean to say all those awful things to you and stuff, and you don't understand me. It's because I have this horrible past, and everybody in their past seems to have done something horrible to them. So that's how they can then lure you back in, because really, if they've lured you in because you're a nice, kind, caring person, what are you going to do at that point? They start telling you how they were abused, and all these little secrets start to trickle out. And a caring person will accept that person back into the fold. Now, that's where you probably should take another look when you see a lot of excused behavior. And another sign is that they are always, and I mean always, the biggest victim in the room, okay? No one is better at playing a victim than they are, which is interesting because they're the ones victimizing people. So the victim fallback position is the number one spot they'll go to. Well, you don't understand me. You weren't there when my father was beating me and my mother was so terrible. And my last job, everybody was horrible to me. And, well, there were reasons why these things happened, but not anything you're going to hear that's going to be truthful. But a victim is something that most kind, empathetic people will fall right into line with, because we have empathy. So, the guy's had a lot of rough knocks, and, his family doesn't talk to them. I mean, they set all these things up. So then you stop asking questions about, why doesn't anybody in your family talk to you? Or, why have you had all these bad relationships? And why has every job had some demon at the helm that got rid of you? So they use that as a key part of their tool, is playing the victim, because they're looking for a type. They're looking for an empathetic person.
So do they know that they're doing this then? You're saying they know.
Yeah, I was actually, to me, that was one of the more interesting things that I found out. I was actually I was very amazed at their ability of self-reflection. And the reason for their self-reflection was to become better at what they do. So they could take situations and take a look at it and think, well, I didn't manipulate this person properly, so I need to change this to do it better the next time. And that was really, let's face it, the reason they contacted me was because they wanted somebody to talk to and explore some of the things that for their thought processes. To really, their goal is the smarter ones. They want to get better at what they do. They just want to get better.
Did any of them scare you, sort of? Like?
No, I've got pretty good boundaries. And they kind of startled me at times. But no, I never got the feeling someone was going to show up at my doorstep. I mean, I had a friend who was like, well, maybe you should write under a pen name. And I thought, well, that kind of, diminishes what I'm doing because it starts to sound kind of shaky. But no, I've got pretty good boundaries. Like, I watch a lot of crime shows and stuff, but I pretty much stop the last hour of the evening before bed. And I've always had pretty good boundaries as far as stuff like that. So no, I never got the idea that anybody was out to get me. They tried to trick me.
Right.
But I just went along with it. It's just, I never got argumentative. I kept my questions to the point, and I just didn't. And I know that frustrated them at times because for the first time they were not in control, and they couldn't access my own emotions because I wasn't showing any of them. I would just say, well, that's interesting. And I wouldn't get any kind of big... I never wanted to make it about me. I wanted to use more of a journalistic approach. So I just didn't let them get to me. But no, I never felt frightened by them.
How do they interact with each other then? Like, you're saying how they... So I'm a psychopath, and I'm looking for, I'm playing a victim. I'm looking at drawing people in, finding out what makes them tick. But how do two psychopaths react to each other?
Well, that was one of the questions in my book that I asked them was, do you know other psychopaths? And yeah, they do. They could identify some in their life. One of them was this guy Bill, who works in some sort of government agency, and he talked a little bit about because of the way that they maneuver information, that I think it's a little bit hard for them to pick each other out. But they do try to pick each other out because they know that if they go to battle over, let's say, a job or something, they need to know who their opponent is. So they do identify each other. But I don't think that necessarily packs of them are attracted to each other per se.
So they don't have a Facebook page or group.
Well, they do. I mean, there's a couple forum places where they, I think it may be just a bunch of kids messing around and trying to sound tough or something. But yeah, they do, and some of them have written stories about themselves. And I got a couple of links from a journalist friend who said you might want to check out this forum. And it's like, no, they're just a bunch of kids kind of joking around, and some of them. Probably out of that group, there's probably a few real ones in there. But they'd be the last people you'd want to have in a group because they'd be too busy manipulating everybody else.
Yeah. It's just crazy. Crazy. Did you get startled by any of them?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
You did, but I mean, was there something in particular that really shocked you, I guess, like you didn't expect?
Well, the drugs was the prescription drugs was the thing that I least expected. And I actually talked to a psychiatrist friend of mine about that, and he had the equally shocked expression. And he said, well, do you think many of them do this? And I said, well, I don't know, because like he stated, they give them out these days like candy. So I really don't know. But that was probably the most shocking part. But the rest of it, I was thoroughly intrigued by reading carefully through their words and how they describe things. So I was probably more intrigued and interested than I was shocked. I'm not really a real shockable kind of a person, I don't have issues with anger or people, so I will usually move away from any kind of confrontation. So I would say that people reading my book have written to me and said they were shocked. one woman, trying to get reviews on Amazon, and one woman, the heading was, don't read this book or something like that, and then I saw it was a 5-star review, and she said because it was the creepiest thing she'd ever read. So, yeah, it's creepy, okay? When you read their words, it's probably creepy more than shocking. Now, it might be shocking to people who realize more about who they had been involved with, because coming to grips with, yeah, that guy really was a psychopath, it really wasn't my imagination, might be more shocking to them. But it's more chilling. Like one of my beta readers said, I started to read this at night, but then I decided that I probably should read it more during the daytime. So it's not creepy in the fact of like people getting murdered or anything, but their words are creepy. When you read their words, they're just creepy.
So these people were not in jail, were they?
No, and probably never would be. No. I thought about that, but everybody's inmates would be like. I'm more interested in the ones who will never be imprisoned, who are out there, because my feeling is that a really good in society psychopath will probably damage more people in their lifetime than the most prolific serial killer. So I've always been more interested in those that aren't incarcerated because they're a lot on a higher level, as far as so to speak, if that term sounds okay.
Right.
They're too clever in a lot of ways to probably ever get caught at what they do, and they will probably resort to murder with pen versus murder with gun.
Right. So now you interviewed 3 males. Do you find that it's more males than females?
That's an interesting question, because people will say 1 to 3 are males and they have this other number that women are real lower. I'm not really sure that I agree with that. I think women probably can be craftier, and probably people don't want to think of women as possibly being that. So, statistically, I don't think anybody really knows, but they always cite that women are lower. But I've had several people at my forum who were engaged with female psychopaths. I've certainly watched enough crime shows where the perp in the situation was a female. I think that women just probably fly under the radar a little bit better than men might.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's hard to. Yeah, maybe they get away with it more.
Yeah, exactly. If you think of abuse, okay, I have known of people, certainly not my friends, but I have known people who were beaten by their wives or significant others, okay?
Yeah.
Men don't admit stuff like that. Men are basically shunned. They think, how could this 6-foot-tall guy get, beaten by his 5-foot-tall wife who, bakes cookies and goes to the PTA meetings? So men are really, in the level of victims, men probably get the worst shaft when they're dealing with a woman psychopath, because really it's unbelievable for people to believe that this woman could have done all these things. So I think women get a lot of passes in life. I think women are just as probably likely to be a psychopath as a male. And nobody's really studied it, but that's just my guess.
Do they ever show their cards? Like, do they let people know? That's not really the right term, but do they kind of let their feelings be known about being a psychopath?
Yeah, that was the part that had been rattling around my brain for years, because over the years, victims would say things like, he told me he had a really dark side, he was evil. And the response was never, I left immediately, okay? The response was, he's had a bad life, it had to have been, he wasn't serious. And these guys actually talked about that. It's like they will tell people, hey, I really am evil and stuff, and the response is usually a laugh and a pat on the arm. So when they do tell people that they tell you these things, is pay attention, because it's probably not a joke. But see, they've gotten you lured in by that point. But really, think about it, Al. If somebody rolled over in bed one day after a few years relationship or even a few months and said, I'm really evil, I got a dark past and stuff, personally, with good boundaries, I don't think I would laugh and just go, but, amazingly, they all tell people stuff like that. And when I asked them we got in a conversation about the eyes, because, the eyes are the mirror of the soul, at least that's what I believe. And if you've ever seen somebody unmasked, it's a horrible experience. It's just evil. And they really didn't know. All they could tell me was what people had said when that happened, that they were scary evil and these kinds of things. And see, there's where you get into the boundaries again, because really, if you've got good boundaries and you get in an argument with somebody and you see evil, okay, you know it's evil because you bring it up the next day and talk about that encounter you had, why do you let that stuff pass? Really, I mean, you really have to think about why. Why would you ever let that kind of behavior be excused? But that's what makes them so good, is a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And that's what really keeps them in business.
Well, people don't want to change their lives sometimes. I think they're set up. You know, they've got a house, a job, a spouse that's a psycho, and a kid, and all of a sudden it's tough to just. That's denial, I think, too.
Well, and also, really, by that point, they've gotten you pretty well isolated. You're not only in denial, but your brains have been rattled around enough, like Ingrid Bergman in the Gaslight movie, that you're not really any longer functioning like the person you were when they first met you. So it's not to be brushed off lightly, because it happens to a lot of people, and they don't see it until they're so many years in. And there have even cases where a person will seek therapy, and the therapist might turn against that person in favor of the psychopath. So there's a lot of denial going around the whole circle. You know, your friends will question, how could you be leaving this great person? Because that's the view that they see. And they're very good at masking the behind the things. So it becomes highly complex, highly, highly complex, just socially and economically, but mainly socially more than anything. Because in this country, you can find an abuse shelter and probably get in. But there's a lot tied up to it. He may be the pillar of the society. They use those things as ways to mask who they really are. They're the guy who's out there coaching the football team and stuff. So, how do you really explain to your friends what he's like behind the scenes? Well, it's hard, it's complicated, and you start to sound crazier and crazier and crazier.
Is there any fix for a psychopath? Like, is there a way of getting better?
Well, they strive to get better, and that their self-reflectiveness is what kind of amazed me the most, as far as their wanting. And also, one of them showed a lot of frustration in that, we come with these skills, and they've got to learn them. So here we go, victim, right? So yeah, I believe that the ones who rise to the top of the corporate chain want to get better to be able to manipulate and control, not to get better so that they can join the church choir. So they want to get better for very different reasons. Like most of us, would want to get better by going to maybe therapy and getting counseling and working on boundary issues. They want to get better so they can pull better maneuvers.
So I guess I shouldn't generalize, but I would say if you're really good at business, you might be a psychopath.
Well, yeah, you actually, in a way, I believe that society rewards that kind of behavior, because they will be able to do things that most people with a conscience wouldn't be able to do. For example, if you're the head of a big company and you've got to lay off a whole bunch of employees and stuff, a psychopath is your guy for the job, because they won't have any problem bending the rules. They won't have any problems in how they get rid of people. They won't blink to disseminate somebody's family life at the flash of a hand to please the shareholders. So that they have to have control. So yeah, they actually would be the kind of personality that unfortunately probably a lot of top corporations would really be looking for to head the organization, because the emotions are out of it.
Yeah, it's pretty strange. Now, you say in your in the intro part about 3 normal psychopaths. What do you mean by that term, normal psychopath?
Yeah, I thought about that wording, and as a writer, I think that I need to take that out because it makes them sound like they're good people.
Well, actually, for me, it made me think, well, there's a normal pattern to psychopaths. That's how I was thinking.
Yeah.
So
it's funny you would bring that up, because I was looking at that copy the other day, and I thought, this makes them look like they,
These
do
are
right
the good
some
ones.
of the time. And it kind of diminishes the actual evil behind it. I think what we were trying to express, which certainly I'll be rushing and changing the copy this afternoon on, is that there are probably people sitting next to you who appear normal,
Right.
but they're not normal. They breathe the same air. They act like they're normal. They act like they're everybody's ideal person, but they're as far from normal as you can get.
Yeah. I know. I thought something like that, but I wanted to make sure. You know, I just interviewed the prosecutor Juan Martinez for the Jodi Arias trial.
Oh, I think he was great. I was recovering from a triple ankle fracture, so I was on that show. I mean, I was watching that cover to cover.
Now she is a psychopath or something like that.
Oh yeah.
You know.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and even when I interviewed Kirk Nurmi, her defense attorney, who tried to get off the case.
Yeah.
She run the case. She wanted to testify, and it kind of comes to what you were saying, how they're in control, and she's going to go up there because she's smarter than everybody else and testify.
Yeah, and I think that she really was playing Juan Martinez for all she could and trying to get him going. And I saw an interview he did where he kept that brush going because he wasn't going to let her get to him. Nurmi, I had different feelings about, but I mean, she took the stand, and those were glorious moments for her. Why do you think most of these people in prison get married? They really have such a self wrapped up in themselves that he must have been a very interesting interview, because I really saw him as a good guy in that whole trial.
Oh, totally. Yeah, it was very interesting. It was interesting to hear his approach, but he was able to handle her because she tried everything. She was very she would forget things and say, "Oh, it's because you're being like my abusive boyfriend," you know? Yeah,
victim, yeah.
I mean, she was very, very quick on her feet.
Yeah, and there were some key things there, too. Like when she had the pictures that she showed him, I think the first night when she showed up at the place, that came up actually on Twitter or something, and people retweeted it to Juan Martinez because, if she was allegedly not planning on going there, why would you have pictures to review with him?
Yeah.
There's 100 ways to commit a crime, but there's 105 ways that they're going to be able to catch you if they pay attention. But, she was always the victim, and that poor family really took the hit. But, see, that shows you the level of what victimhood will go to. She was that victim, and she, I think that poor guy was set up, obviously. Yeah. And it shows the pattern and how they manipulate people into that victim role. She was always a victim to everything. Everything.
Yeah, and do you think things like that should be televised? Do you think that promotes it?
No, I think that people should. It is a public forum. I think that all this stuff should be televised because I think that we as the public, it's kind of like how we've kind of lost control over the police situation in some states. They feel like if somebody looks at them the wrong way, a handgun is a solution. And they've lost the feeling that they're public servants. And I believe that the courts are our public view into the world. So, yes, I very much am in favor of publicizing trials. I think it's our right as citizens to be able to look into that.
Yeah, I just wonder if, and even with again with Nurmi and with Martinez, I was wondering how it affected them, because when you start doing a trial that becomes public, then all of a sudden press is outside of your door every single day. They're talking about what you wear, what your hair's like. And I got to think that's going to affect you in your performance.
Well, I think in the O.J. case, I mean, clearly the judge there affected his performance, Well,
even Marcia Clark, I mean, they're throwing around nude pictures of her, right, and stuff. I mean, how...
Yeah. Well, remember that lady who testified for Nurmi from the abuse center, that woman? She really got taken over the coals with the social media as far as people, death threats and people bombing her book that she'd written and all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, we're in the day and age that hurling around insults and mean comments are more the norm than looking for the good. So, but, I think that, if you're being asked to testify at a trial where somebody is clearly a psychopath and you're going to testify for the defense, I think, I would use some caution. But I do believe that everybody has a right to a fair trial. But, anybody can drag in a witness. I mean, really, because that woman knew nothing, really. But, she really got taken over the coals. I didn't see that, people went after Martinez for signing some autographs or whatever, and I didn't see any of that in him. He just happened to be out there, and it was some woman who had traveled a long ways and had a cane. And it wasn't a big deal. But people will take little tiny things and make it into a huge ordeal.
Yeah.
They won't like this and they won't like that. It's back like when I first got involved on online forums during the JonBenet Ramsey case. There were a couple of meetups of people who were little true crime people like myself who were it was one of the first active forums about the big murder, so it was a real whodunit. And people, it was interesting because some of the most vicious people, it was at the Denver Post forum, who were generally not liked by most people. When people's comments after they met them, they were talking about how nice they were. So I think people behave outrageously behind their keyboards that they might not in person.
I think it's a whole new learning process,
we're in a new media.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to, and I kind of went through a little bit of that insecurity myself because no one's really written from the angle that I've written from. So I went through a lot of insecurities at first thinking, will they like me? Will they like what I did? And so
believe me, you can't win.
I
no
know.
matter what.
Yeah, like I hate those glasses she's wearing.
Yeah.
She looks too old. I kind of had to, go back to my own sense of boundaries and say, hey, I have a message that I want to get out there that I truly believe will be able to help people. And be ready for that. And it's just the new society that we're involved in. So, that was Juan Martinez, and then really took a big hit from all directions. But, maybe hopefully to social media, maybe it helped them to think, if you're smart, you're watching social media. Back when I worked in high tech, they all had huge departments that did nothing but watch competition and whatnot. Yeah. So to me, it's just kind of like the old days where it was done more discreetly, because there wasn't Twitter and everything. But, it's watching your competition. And if enough people say the same bad thing over and over again, maybe instead of discounting it, you should pay attention to it. Maybe I do wear the wrong color glasses, 500 people.
Well, I can only go so far, because you can get into that and then that's what I mean. Then you start focusing on it. So I'd rather not. I'll just wear the wrong glasses.
Yeah, I do too. I'm of the nature that I'm not out looking for problems with other people, and I try to think in terms of kindness before I open my mouth. There's nothing to be gained by running somebody down. But, it's amazing that the social media thing actually plays into the psychopath thing, because I personally think the Internet is like the best invention for psychopaths on earth.
Oh, yeah. It's all the information's on your hands, and all the people
Well, all the people that you can write and boast to, and all the people that you can maneuver, all the people that you can have multiple relationships with online, all the ways you can hide things. I mean, it really is like steroids for psychopaths, because it provides that platform. But I don't think people making all the nasty comments are psychopaths, but I think that the psychopath would probably be making the nice comments, because remember, they're luring you in. There's always that fishing pole out. So.
Wow, it's been a great hour. I love this. Now, what's your contact information for people? So if some psychopaths want to call you, or or pick up your book,
Yeah, well, the book is available on Amazon, and my name is Diane with 2 N's, Emerson, and it's Psychopaths in Our Lives, My Interviews. And I would appreciate if you read it and like it, to leave me some feedback. You can always learn, one way of feedback or not. And my forum is psychopath-research.com. And my email is diane@psychopath-research.com. But I will advise people that I personally try to stay out of the advice business when it comes to, if you have a story and you like to talk, your best place. My forum kind of went dormant the last couple of years because I was rather distracted with this book. So, there's lots of data there. There's lots of victim stories. There's lots of stuff to read. I'm trying to get it reactivated again with the discussion part because really I was just way, way, way involved. There's a lot to a book, editing, writing, everything else. So I don't tend to offer people advice or diagnosis because I'm really not able to. And I find that people interchanging with other people in the same situation is a more powerful tool. That's why I encourage people to write, because a lot of people over the years have discovered things by writing their story down there, because you look at things differently. It's just why journaling is a good idea, which I've always failed miserably at. But if you write about your situation, you'll see it in a whole new light. It's almost like self-therapy. So I find that people are better off to join each other in talking about their situation and seeing that they're really, they all walk away feeling like they were crazy. So it's a very relieving kind of a thing to work through the process, talk about it with others, and to realize that you're really not crazy. It really wasn't you. It's just it's that fork in the road that went the wrong way.
The way it is. Well, Diane, thank you very much for taking the time to talk.
Well, thank you, Al. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you, and I will look forward to, if you have any more questions or you want to have a show about evil or anything, I'm your gal.
Great.
Show is over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of the Z-Talk Radio Network.
I'll be